Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Here is something worth sitting with before we begin tonight. At some point in the middle of the 20th century, the most powerful military nation on Earth, a country with aircraft carriers, strategic bombers, chemical defoliants, and at its peak more than 500,000 troops stationed in a single foreign country, spent nearly 2 full decades trying to win a war in Southeast Asia. It failed. The man most responsible for that outcome was not a decorated general from a great military family. He was not a wealthy aristocrat, not a politician backed by institutions. He started life as the youngest child of a village scholar in one of the least celebrated provinces of French colonial Vietnam. If you are enjoying these stories, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. I genuinely appreciate it every time. And wherever you are watching from right now, whether it is past midnight in Sydney, 2 in the morning in Berlin, or a quiet evening somewhere in the American South, drop your location and local time in the comments. It helps other sleepless people find their way here too. Now settle in. Let your shoulders drop, let the day finish without you, and come back to the late 19th century, to the central coastlands of Vietnam. Tonight we begin not with revolution, but with a quiet house, a father's stubborn dignity, and a country that already belonged to someone else. Vietnam in the late 1800s was not a country in any way that its people were permitted to define. France had been pressing into Vietnamese territory since 1858, when French warships opened fire on Da Nang, beginning a campaign that unfolded over nearly 3 decades. The South fell first. The French renamed it Cochinchina and administered it as a direct colony. The central region, which France called Annam, and the northern region of Tonkin followed, absorbed as protectorates, territories where local rulers were kept in place as visible formalities, while the real decisions belonged to officials in Hanoi and Paris. By 1887, France had organized the whole arrangement into French Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos bound together under a single governor-general. The Vietnamese had existed as a distinct civilization for more than 2,000 years before any French warship appeared on their coast. They had resisted and eventually expelled Chinese occupation across multiple dynasties. They had built systems of governance, agriculture, literature, and philosophy shaped by a version of Confucian thought adapted over centuries to fit Vietnamese life. None of that was erased by French colonialism, but it was repositioned. Vietnamese history became the background of a territory whose current purpose was economic output. What the French installed in practical terms was a new architecture of obligations. The colonial government taxed rice production, taxed salt, taxed the movement of goods between provinces. They installed monopolies on opium, alcohol, and salt, 3 things that had deep roots in Vietnamese daily life, either as necessities or cultural practices. The opium monopoly generated something close to 1/3 of the colonial government's operating revenue at its height. The French had not brought opium to Vietnam. The drug had been present in Southeast Asian societies well before European colonialism arrived, but they licensed its distribution, controlled its sale, and collected the proceeds with an efficiency that the people financing it were not invited to discuss. It was an extractive system that ran very smoothly, provided you did not look too closely at where the money was actually coming from. Beyond taxation, the corvée system compelled Vietnamese men to provide unpaid labor on colonial construction and infrastructure projects. Roads, rail lines, bridges, and administrative buildings were built by people who had no legal right to refuse. Colonial officials described this as a traditional and reasonable arrangement. The men doing the work tended to hold a different view, though expressing that view publicly carried its own risks. In Nghệ An province, in the narrow coastal strip of central Vietnam where mountain ranges press down toward the South China Sea, a scholar named Nguyen Sinh Sac lived with his family inside these ordinary conditions of colonial life. Nghệ An had a character recognized across Vietnam long before the French arrived. The soil was thin in many areas, the weather harsh and unpredictable, and the people by the general assessment of Vietnamese historians, writers, and the population itself had developed over generations a reputation for stubbornness, endurance, and a long institutional memory of resistance. The province had produced rebels, scholars, and national figures in roughly equal measure over the centuries. Multiple uprisings against external authority had either originated in Guyane or passed through it. That reputation was already centuries old when the youngest child of Nguyen Sin Sac arrived in the world. Nguyen Sin Sac had spent the better part of his adult life preparing for the Pho Bang examination, the second highest degree available in the Vietnamese imperial examination system. It required mastery of classical Confucian texts, literary composition, and philosophical argument, a layered and unforgiving test that most candidates failed repeatedly before either passing or giving up. He passed it in 1900. The achievement was genuine. It brought real standing in the local community and opened, in theory, access to positions within the imperial and colonial administrative structure. In practice, those positions in late colonial Vietnam meant working within the French system at the provincial and local level. Nguyen Sin Sac, having earned precisely those qualifications, proved persistently reluctant to use them in that way. He accepted a minor magistrate post briefly, but was removed following an accusation of excessive force against a prisoner. Whether the charge was fully just has been debated since. What is documented is that he did not return to colonial administrative work afterward. He spent the remaining decades of his life moving between different parts of Vietnam, practicing traditional medicine and maintaining an irregular presence in the lives of his children. His youngest child was born on the 19th of May, 1890, in the village of Kim Lien in Guyane province. The name given at birth was Nguyen Sin Kung. He had an older brother, Nguyen Sin Kim, and an older sister, Nguyen Thi Tan. Kim Lien was a modest village, a cluster of thatched houses arranged around rice paddies and vegetable plots, with a communal hall where village men gathered for festivals and local ceremonies. The family home was simple. The household standing in the community rested on the father's scholarly reputation, not on any material wealth, and the gap between reputation and income was a daily fact of life. The mother, Hoang Thi Loan, kept the household running during the long years of her husband's absences for study. She died sometime around 1900 or 1901, when her youngest child was still very young. Her death altered the household in ways that were quiet but lasting. The family moved with the father, and the stability she had provided did not reassemble itself. What the child absorbed during those early years was not ideology or formal political thought. It was something more basic, the texture of colonial life observed from the inside of it. He watched his father navigate the contradiction of being a man of great scholarly achievement inside a system that wanted that achievement put to colonial use. He grew up in a province with an intact memory of resistance, surrounded by adults who carried their grievances with the patience of people who knew they had no short-term recourse. Around 1905, the family relocated to Hue, the old imperial capital of central Vietnam. The Nguyen dynasty still held court there inside the forbidden Purple City, and the emperor performed his ceremonies with the full ceremonial weight of Vietnamese tradition. The French resident superior ran the actual administration. The arrangement had a particular quality the forms of Vietnamese sovereignty carefully maintained, the substance of it residing elsewhere. The boy, increasingly known as Nguyen Tat Tan, a name his father gave him meaning roughly, he who will succeed, enrolled at the Quoc Hoc School, the national academy the French had established partly to produce educated Vietnamese who could participate in the colonial system. In Hue, the machinery of colonial rule was harder to ignore than in rural Guyane. The gap between Vietnamese daily life and French administrative comfort was visible in the streets. Public floggings took place. Petitioners waited outside French offices for audiences that often did not come. The matter-of-fact ease with which European officials moved through a Vietnamese city communicated something that no formal lesson could quite convey. At the same time, he encountered through teachers and fellow students the ideas of Phan Boi Chau and Phan Chu Trinh, the two most prominent Vietnamese nationalist voices of the era, men who disagreed sharply on method but agreed entirely that French control of Vietnam could not be the permanent condition of the country. He was a teenager in a school designed to produce obedient subjects, being educated by teachers who were in some cases nothing of the kind. The question that would define the next 60 years of his life, what could actually be done, and how, had not yet taken any concrete form, but it was forming, quietly, with a particular patience that Nguyen seemed to breed into its people. A young man boards a ship. In 1908, a wave of protests spread through central Vietnam. The immediate cause was the French colonial government's intensification of tax collection across annum head taxes, land taxes, expanded corvée labour requirements, pressing down on a rural population that had been living close to the edge for years. Peasants began marching on French administrative centres in several provinces, demanding relief. The French suppressed the demonstrations and arrested a number of people they identified as having organised or enabled them. Nguyen Tat Than, then a student at the Quoc Hoc School in Hue, was involved in some capacity, serving as an interpreter between French officials and protesting peasants in at least one account, though the precise nature of his participation has been pieced together from incomplete records. What is clear is that by the end of that year he was no longer enrolled at the school. Whether he departed on his own terms or was pushed out because of his associations with the protests is a detail that different biographies resolve differently. The practical result was the same. He was a young man in his late teens, in colonial Vietnam, without an institutional path forward, and with an increasingly clear understanding of what he thought about the situation he had been born into. He spent time in 1909 teaching at the Duc Than School in Phan Thiet, a coastal town further south along the Vietnamese coastline. The school had been founded by Vietnamese nationalists and operated with a deliberate degree of independence from the standard colonial curriculum. He taught Vietnamese and Chinese classical subjects, both of which he knew deeply, and French, which his students needed for practical reasons. He was not yet 20 years old. The position was temporary, and he seems to have understood that it was. His father had relocated to the south by then, working various positions in Cochinchina, and the family had scattered in different directions. Sometime around 1910 or 1911, he made his way to Saigon, the largest city in French Indochina and its commercial centre, thoroughly reshaped over the previous decades into something that looked, in its central quarters, more like a southern French provincial town than anything grown organically from the Vietnamese land around it. He had come to understand that the knowledge he needed could not be found in colonial Indochina. The world outside Vietnam had to be seen directly, not read about in whatever publications the colonial administration permitted. He applied for work on a French ocean liner, the Amiral Latouche Treville, under the name Van Bar. He was hired as a kitchen assistant. In the early summer of 1911, the ship left Saigon with him on it, and Vietnam disappeared behind him for what would turn out to be many years. The route took the ship through Southeast Asian ports, around the southern African coast, and through stops along the West African coastline before continuing toward France. In ports like Dakar and along the Gulf of Guinea, he saw French colonial administration operating in a different geography but with a structure he recognized immediately. African populations taxed and managed and moved around according to the needs of a distant government. The faces were different, the languages were different. The underlying logic was not. Empire, he was learning, did not vary much in its essential design regardless of where it happened to be installed. He arrived in Marseille and eventually made his way off the ship. What followed was several years of movement through the Atlantic world, years that were materially difficult, often lonely, and extraordinarily formative in ways that would only become fully apparent decades later. He came to the United States sometime around 1912 or 1913, landing in New York and working in Brooklyn for a period. He swept snow. He worked in hotel kitchens. He carried things that needed carrying. He was doing what immigrant laborers from every part of the world had always done in New York, taking whatever work was available while watching the city with great care. What he found in America was not uncomplicated. The country had embedded in its founding documents a set of declarations about human freedom and equality that were, in their language, among the most ambitious ever committed to paper. It also had a black population living under a system of segregation and legal discrimination whose structural logic was not entirely unlike what he had grown up watching in Guyane. The distance between what a country said about itself and what it actually did to the people inside it was a gap that he filed carefully away. He would return to it many times. From the United States, he made his way to London, arriving sometime around 1913. He worked various jobs, labourer, kitchen hand, assistant in whatever capacity required, no letters of recommendation, and eventually secured a position at the Carlton Hotel, one of the most prestigious establishments in the city. The Carlton at that time operated under the supervision of Auguste Escoffier, the French chef who had spent decades systematically reorganizing professional kitchens across Europe, and who was, by 1913, widely regarded as the defining figure of modern French cuisine. Somewhere in the Carlton's pastry section, according to the most reliable accounts, a young man from Guyane was preparing confections while quietly developing a fairly comprehensive framework for understanding the structural contradictions of the French Empire. Escoffier, who had codified the Brigade de Cuisine, revolutionized classical French cooking, and served heads of state across the continent, appears to have been entirely unaware of this particular dimension of his kitchen operations. The work was hard, and the hours were long, which was precisely the condition under which most people in the Carlton's lower staff lived, and which gave its workers a rather unromantic view of the establishment's elegance. He was not complaining about this. He was learning from it. He made connections in London with Vietnamese, Chinese, and other colonial and immigrant workers. He began to find in the city's labour movements and immigrant communities people who were asking versions of the same questions he had been asking since Hugh. The early 20th century in London was a period of genuine intellectual ferment. Labour organising, socialist theory, anti-imperial thought, all of it was circulating in pamphlets and meeting halls and the back rooms of pubs in working-class neighbourhoods. He was not yet a communist. He had not yet encountered Marxism in any systematic form, but he was absorbing a vocabulary of political thought that would eventually give shape to everything he already knew from experience. He read widely during these years. In the libraries and reading rooms available to him, and through whatever publications came his way, he was working through labour newspapers, political tracts, accounts of resistance movements in Ireland, India, and elsewhere. The Irish struggle against British rule interested him particularly, not because the situations were identical, they were not, but because it offered a close study of how a colonised people organised themselves against an empire that had been in place long enough to seem permanent. His languages expanded alongside everything else. His French had been strong since Hugh. English came through daily necessity. He continued working on his Chinese. The ability to move between languages was both a practical tool and a way of understanding how differently people in different parts of the world were being told the same story about why things had to be the way they were. His father was still somewhere in southern Vietnam by this point, living modestly, practicing medicine, and maintaining his principled detachment from the colonial administrative structure that had defined and ultimately derailed his career. The son was doing something different, not refusing, exactly, but learning the system he intended one day to dismantle from the inside of it, working his way through its kitchens and ports and labour markets with the patience of someone who understood that preparation was not the same as waiting. By around 1917, he had moved on to Paris. The city was enormous, politically alive, full of colonial subjects from across the French Empire, Vietnamese, North Africans, West Africans, Senegalese, many of them working the same kinds of jobs he had been working, and many of them asking the same kinds of questions. The Great War had just ended, or was ending, and the peace conference that would try to reorganize the world was coming. For a man who had spent 6 years watching empire operate from its most functional levels, Paris in 1917 and 1918 was the most important place on earth to be. He arrived with no money, no formal political connections, and no particular reputation. That was about to change. Paris and the petition nobody read. Paris, in 1917, was a city under pressure. The Great War had been grinding through its 3rd year, and the French capital was simultaneously the administrative heart of a global empire, the supply base for a front that had already consumed millions of lives, and a gathering place for people from every corner of that empire who had been drawn to the city by work, exile, or the particular gravity that major capitals exert on the politically restless. Vietnamese workers had been brought to France in large numbers during the war itself. Labourers and factory hands recruited from Indochina to fill industrial positions vacated by Frenchmen sent to the front. They lived in the city's poorer arrondissements, worked long hours, and formed the kind of tightly connected emigrant community that tends to develop wherever people far from home share both a language and a grievance. He arrived in this environment and settled into it with the practicality of someone who had been navigating foreign cities for years. He found a room in the Latin Quarter small and inexpensive, as rooms in that part of Paris consistently were for people without money. He found work as a photo retoucher, a trade that required a steady hand and an eye for detail, both of which he had. He was known in the Vietnamese community by several names during these years, but the one that attached itself most firmly to him in Paris was Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot. It was a name with intent. He did not choose it modestly. Phan Chu Trinh was already in Paris. The older man, one of the 2 major Vietnamese nationalist voices of the previous generation, the one who had argued for modernization and cultural pressure rather than armed resistance, had been living in France since 1911, working as a photo retoucher himself, which says something about the limited range of employment options available to educated Vietnamese exiles in early 20th century Paris. The 2 men knew of each other before they met, and they became close, though they were never entirely aligned. Phan Chu Trinh still believed, or wanted to believe, that France could be persuaded to reform its relationship with Vietnam from within. The younger man was less convinced of this, and growing less convinced by the year. Another figure in the Paris circle was Phan Van Truong, a Vietnamese lawyer who had trained in France and who had the kind of professional standing that gave the emigrant community access to French legal and political networks they could not otherwise reach. Between these 3 and a wider circle of Vietnamese workers, students, and political exiles, there was a constant flow of conversation about what was possible, what was coming, and what ought to be done. What was coming, in 1918 and into 1919, was the Paris Peace Conference. The Great War had formally ended in November of 1918, and the major powers were gathering at Versailles to settle what a post-war world would look like. For colonized peoples across the globe, the conference arrived with a specific charge of possibility attached to it. The source of that possibility was Woodrow Wilson, the American president, who had announced his 14 points as the framework for a just peace. The relevant phrase, the one that circulated through emigrant communities and nationalist movements from Vietnam to India to West Africa, was self-determination. Wilson had declared that peoples had the right to determine their own political futures. He had said this clearly and repeatedly. Colonized peoples, quite reasonably, took him at his word. In Paris, Nguyen Ai Quoc and his colleagues drafted a document. They called it the Revendications du Peuple Annamite, the demands of the Vietnamese people. It was a measured and carefully worded petition, not a revolutionary manifesto. It did not call for immediate independence. It called for a series of specific reforms: freedom of the press in Vietnam, freedom of assembly, amnesty for Vietnamese political prisoners, equal rights under the law for Vietnamese and French citizens in Indochina, Vietnamese representation in the French Parliament, and the replacement of French rule by decree with a system of actual law. These were, by any reasonable reading, moderate requests. They were presented in the language and framework of the liberal democratic principles that the Allied powers had been publicly claiming to fight for throughout the entire war. He rented a mourning coat for the occasion and had photographs taken in it. He wanted to look the part of someone who expected to be received by world leaders. He submitted the petition to the delegations of the major powers gathered at Versailles, to Wilson's delegation, to the British delegation, to the French delegation of Georges Clemenceau. He sought audiences. He wrote letters. He used every avenue available to a Vietnamese man in Paris with no institutional backing, no diplomatic standing, and no particular reason to expect a warm reception. The petition was ignored, not rejected formally, not debated and dismissed, simply not responded to. Wilson's principle of self-determination, it emerged with increasing clarity over the following months, was intended for the peoples of the collapsed European empires, for the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, not for Vietnamese or Indians or Algerians. The distinction was never stated plainly as policy, but it was applied with remarkable consistency. The peace conference reorganized the map of Europe and distributed the German colonial territories among the Allied powers. The principle of self-determination made no appearance in the outcome for any Asian or African population. Nguyen Ai Quoc returned his borrowed mourning coat and drew the appropriate conclusions. He kept writing. He was a contributing writer by now for several French left-wing publications, and in 1922 he would help found Le Paria, the Outcast, a newspaper specifically aimed at colonized people living in France, which ran articles about conditions in French Indochina, Madagascar, West Africa, and other parts of the empire, and which the French colonial intelligence service tracked with the attentiveness that comes from not quite knowing what to do about something that is technically legal. He was developing a voice as a journalist, sharp, direct, evidence-based, and consistently focused on the gap between France's stated democratic values and its colonial practices. But the event that reoriented everything happened in 1920. At the Congress of Tours in December of that year, the French Socialist Party held a vote on whether to join the Communist International, the Comintern, the Moscow-based organization through which Lenin was attempting to build a coordinated international revolutionary movement. The party split. The majority voted to join. Nguyen Ai Quoc voted with the majority. The reason he gave, later and many times, was Lenin. Specifically, it was Lenin's theses on the national and colonial question, published in 1920, which Nguyen Ai Quoc read and which answered, more directly than anything else he had encountered, the question he had been carrying since Hugh. The socialist and labour movements of Western Europe were primarily concerned with the condition of European workers inside European industrial capitalism. They addressed colonialism as a secondary concern, if at all. Lenin's thesis argued that the liberation of colonized peoples and the liberation of European workers were not separate problems, that imperialism was the economic foundation of European capitalism, and that revolution in the colonies was inseparable from revolution at home. For a man who had spent a decade watching empire operate from its lower decks, this framework had an immediate coherence that the older European socialist traditions, with their occasional awkwardness about colonial subjects, did not. He was not naive about what joining the Communist International meant, or about Moscow's interests. He was a precise and unsentimental reader of political situations. But the framework Lenin offered, the idea that anti-colonial nationalism and international communist organization were not in conflict, but in fact required each other, gave him a political home for the first time. He had been building an analysis for years. Now he had a structure to put it in. He was 30 years old, living in a rented room in Paris, writing for a newspaper that the French government was watching, working as a photo retoucher, and becoming, piece by piece, one of the most consequential political organizers of the 20th century. None of this was visible yet to anyone paying attention from a distance. The French Colonial Intelligence Service had a file on him. That was the extent of his official recognition. The next stage of his education was about to take him further east, to Moscow, where the institutional machinery of international communism had been assembled, and where the practical business of turning anti-colonial sentiment into organized revolutionary action was being worked out in seminars and training programs run by people who believed, with varying degrees of accuracy, that they knew how history worked. He was going to find it useful, and also limiting, in ways he could not have fully predicted when he boarded the train. Moscow, Canton, and the revolutionary classroom. He left Paris for Moscow in 1923. The journey east took him through Germany, and at some point in that transit he shed whatever remained of the life he had been building in the French capital, the newspaper work, the emigrant community, the rented room, and moved into the larger and considerably more structured world of international communist organization. Moscow, in 1923, was a city still digesting the events of the previous decade. The revolution of 1917 had installed the Bolsheviks in power. The civil war that followed had been won at enormous cost, and the Soviet state was now, 6 years on, in the process of figuring out what it actually was and where it was going. The Communist International, the Comintern, had been established in 1919 as the coordinating body for communist parties around the world, and its Moscow headquarters was the operational center of an organization that genuinely believed it was managing the early stages of a worldwide revolutionary transformation. The belief was held with varying degrees of rigor and self-awareness depending on which office you were sitting in. Nguyen Ai Quoc enrolled at the University of the Toilers of the East, an institution established specifically to train revolutionary cadres from colonized and semi-colonized countries, students from India, China, Korea, Persia, Vietnam, and across Africa and the Middle East, who were brought to Moscow to study Marxist theory, organizational methods, and the practical mechanics of building a revolutionary movement. The education was systematic and thorough, and for a man who had spent the previous decade building a political analysis from raw observation, the theoretical framework it provided was genuinely useful. He absorbed it quickly, held on to the parts that applied to his situation, and filed the rest. He was not, even in these early Moscow years, straightforwardly obedient to the Comintern's direction. He pushed consistently on the colonial question, arguing, in meetings and in writing, that the international communist movement paid insufficient attention to the anti-colonial struggles of Asia and Africa, that it tended to treat these struggles as secondary to the main business of European working-class revolution, and that this was both a strategic and a moral error. The Comintern's official position on colonialism was supportive in principle, but the practical resources and organizational attention directed toward Asia were considerably less than what was directed toward Europe. He kept saying this, in careful and documented ways, throughout his time in Moscow. In 1924, he attended the 5th Congress of the Comintern, where he delivered a speech on conditions in Indochina and the failure of the international left to take colonialism seriously enough as a revolutionary force. The speech made an impression on some people and was politely noted by others. The Comintern was an organization with a great deal of theoretical energy and a number of practical limitations, one of which was a tendency to apply European frameworks to Asian situations without fully accounting for how different those situations were. Nguyen Ai Quoc was one of the most persistent voices pointing this out, which earned him respect in some quarters and careful management in others. Later in 1924, the Comintern sent him to Canton Guangzhou, in southern China, where Soviet advisor Mikhail Borodin was working with Sun Yat-sen and the Chinese Nationalist Party. The Kuomintang, in an arrangement that paired Chinese nationalist ambitions with Soviet organizational support. It was a complicated alliance, built on interests that overlapped more than they coincided, and it operated under the assumption held more firmly in some quarters than others that the partnership would survive whatever tensions the future brought. Canton in 1924 and 1925 was consequently one of the most politically alive cities in Asia. The Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party were cooperating, however uneasily, within the same organizational structure. Soviet advisors were everywhere. Vietnamese, Korean, and other exiles were moving through the city pursuing their own revolutionary projects in the margins of the larger drama. He arrived as a Comintern representative and translator, working within Borodin's operation in an official capacity while quietly building something of his own in parallel. In 1925, he founded the Revolutionary Youth League of Vietnam, known in Vietnamese as Thanh Nien, meaning simply youth, which was the first organized revolutionary training structure specifically aimed at producing Vietnamese communist cadres. He recruited young Vietnamese men, many of them students and workers who had made their way to China to escape French surveillance or to find a path that colonial Indochina did not offer them. He ran training classes. He wrote a text called Duong Kach Men, The Road to Revolution, which served as both a political education primer and a practical manual for revolutionary organizing. It covered Marxist theory, the nature of imperialism, the structure of colonial exploitation, and the specific conditions facing Vietnam. He was producing in Canton the first generation of trained Vietnamese revolutionaries. During these same years, two of the most important figures of the previous generation of Vietnamese nationalism departed the scene. Phan Boi Chau, the man who had argued for armed resistance and sought foreign alliances throughout his career, was arrested by French agents in Shanghai in 1925 and brought back to Vietnam to stand trial for sedition. The trial became, unexpectedly, a massive public event. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. The French sentenced him to hard labor and then, apparently concerned about the reaction his imprisonment was generating, commuted the sentence to house arrest in Hue, where he would spend the remaining years of his life under supervision. His active political life was effectively finished. The following year, Phan Chu Trinh died in Saigon. He had returned to Vietnam from France in poor health and died in March of 1926. His funeral drew tens of thousands of Vietnamese into the streets of Saigon, workers, students, merchants, in what became one of the largest demonstrations of Vietnamese nationalist sentiment the French had witnessed to that point. The French allowed it to proceed and watched it carefully. The men who had defined Vietnamese nationalism for the previous 2 decades were gone or silenced, and the generation now taking shape in Canton training sessions was a different kind of animal, entirely more theoretically organized, more strategically focused, and operating with a harder understanding of what resistance was going to require. The political situation in China was meanwhile moving toward a crisis that would disrupt everything. The alliance between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party had always been unstable, held together by the common goal of reunifying China under nationalist control against the warlords and foreign powers that had been dividing it. Once the Northern Expedition, the Kuomintang's military campaign to consolidate control over China, began making progress in 1926 and into 1927, the internal contradictions of the alliance became harder to manage. Chiang Kai-shek, who had consolidated leadership of the Kuomintang following Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, was deeply suspicious of the Communist Party's growing influence within the nationalist movement. In April of 1927, he acted on that suspicion with thoroughness and violence. The Shanghai Massacre of April 1927 was the beginning of what became known as the White Terror, Chiang Kai-shek's systematic, violent suppression of the Chinese Communist Party across the cities Kuomintang controlled. Communists and suspected communists were arrested, shot, and executed in large numbers over the following weeks and months. The Comintern's assumption that the alliance with the Kuomintang could be sustained had turned out to be mistaken in the most direct way possible, and the people most exposed to that mistake were the ones who had been working inside the alliance's organizational structures. Nguyen Ai Quoc was in Canton when the situation collapsed. He left. He had to. The network of Vietnamese trainees he had been building was disrupted. Though not destroyed, the cadres he had trained scattered into China and back toward Indochina, carrying with them the organizational training and the political framework he had spent 2 years developing. He moved under cover, operating under different names, making his way through a China that was now actively dangerous for anyone associated with the Comintern. He was 37 years old, stateless in any practical sense, wanted by the French colonial authorities, operating in a country that had just violently reorganized its political landscape in ways that affected everything he had been building. The organizational work in Canton had not been wasted. The people trained there would be central to what came next. But the next phase would have to be built in different conditions, in different places, and with the understanding that the path forward was going to require more patience and more flexibility than even he had previously calculated. The years of most active difficulty were just beginning. The man of many names. After Canton, he moved. This was not unusual. Movement had been the basic condition of his adult life since 1911, but the movement after 1927 had a different quality to it. It was not the movement of someone building towards something visible. It was the movement of someone keeping themselves operational under conditions that were actively hostile, while trying not to become too fixed in any one place long enough to be arrested. He passed back through Europe, spending time in Brussels and Berlin before returning to Moscow. The Soviet capital in 1927 and 1928 was a different place from the Moscow. He had arrived in 4 years earlier. Lenin had died in 1924. The succession struggle within the Soviet Communist Party had resolved itself, for the time being, in Stalin's favor, and the particular atmosphere of the Comintern, its internal politics, its relationship between Moscow's priorities and the priorities of communist movements elsewhere in the world was shifting in ways that were not entirely comfortable for someone like Nguyen Ai Quoc, who had always maintained that Asian anti-colonial struggle had its own logic that European frameworks could not fully contain. The Comintern sent him east again in 1928, this time to Thailand Siam, as it was then known specifically to work among the large communities of Vietnamese who had emigrated to northeastern Siam over the previous decades. These communities had grown up in the provinces along the Mekong River, in towns like Udon Thani and Nakhon Phanom, and they maintained deep cultural and familial connections to Vietnam across a border that the colonial administration monitored but could not fully seal. For an organizer trying to reach Vietnamese people outside the direct reach of French colonial surveillance, the Siamese Vietnamese communities were both a refuge and a resource. He lived among them for nearly 2 years, disguised as a Buddhist monk at various points, using the name Songman Cho among several others. He organized, educated, recruited, and communicated quietly, carefully, through networks of trust built slowly in the way that underground organizing requires. His cover was convincing enough that French intelligence, which was tracking him with genuine effort, lost his trail for extended periods. The French colonial security apparatus had a file on Nguyen Ai Quoc that had been growing since the Paris years, but tracking him required knowing which name he was currently using and which country he was currently in, both of which he managed to keep unclear with some consistency. He had, by this point in his life, operated under so many names: Nguyen Sinh Kung, Nguyen Tat Than, Van Ba, Nguyen Ai Quoc, Lai Thuai, Songman Cho, and others, that the French colonial intelligence service maintained what amounted to a small catalogue of identities they suspected might belong to the same person. The suspicion was correct. The catalogue was incomplete. This was, from his perspective, the acceptable state of affairs. In early 1930, he moved to Hong Kong, and there, on the 3rd of February, he convened a meeting that produced one of the most consequential organizational decisions of his career. Vietnamese communist organizing had fragmented into at least 3 competing factions in the years since Canton groups with slightly different ideological emphases and different organizational bases, none strong enough to be effective on its own and all reluctant to subordinate themselves to the others. He brought representatives of all 3 factions to Hong Kong and, through a combination of argument, personal authority, and the pressure of circumstances, persuaded them to unify into a single organization. The result was the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the ICP, formally established at that February meeting. It was the organizational structure through which Vietnamese revolutionary activity would be coordinated for the next 15 years. The timing proved immediately significant. In the same year the ICP was founded, a series of uprisings broke out in Guyane and Ha Tinh provinces in central Vietnam, precisely the region where Ho Chi Minh had been born and where popular grievance against French colonial taxation and land policy had been building. For years, the peasant Soviets' local committees that attempted to take over administrative functions from the French colonial structure briefly controlled parts of both provinces. Workers at French-owned plantations went on strike. The uprisings were the most significant act of organized mass resistance against French colonial rule in Vietnam since the late 19th century. The French response was overwhelming and methodical. Aircraft bombed villages in Guyane. Troops moved through the province systematically. The colonial administration arrested hundreds and executed dozens. The ICP's organizational networks, which had been involved in the uprisings to varying degrees, were heavily damaged. A generation of cadres who had been trained through the Canton years and the subsequent organizing work was killed, imprisoned, or driven underground. The Ingayan Soviet, as it became known, lasted only a few months before the French suppressed it entirely. He was in Hong Kong when most of this was happening, and he was not in Hong Kong freely for long. In June of 1931, British colonial police arrested him under the name Sung Man Cho and held him in custody. The French colonial government requested his extradition. If that request was granted, the most likely outcome was a death sentence in Vietnam. The extradition case became a legal and diplomatic proceeding that lasted nearly 2 years. A British lawyer named Frank Loosby took his case and argued, on procedural and humanitarian grounds, that extradition was impermissible. Loosby's argument eventually prevailed in the courts, though the process was not quick or certain at any stage. While the legal proceedings continued, the prisoner fell seriously ill with tuberculosis, or what was diagnosed and treated as tuberculosis, and was moved from prison to a hospital, which provided somewhat better conditions but no certainty about what would happen when the medical crisis resolved. During this period, reports circulated in various communist and nationalist circles that Nguyen Ai Quoc had died in Hong Kong, that the illness had been fatal, that the British had handed him over to the French, that he had been executed. These reports were false, but they persisted and spread widely enough that the French colonial administration actually recorded his death in their files. He was, as far as the French authorities were concerned, a closed case. This was, under the circumstances, not the worst outcome. He was released from British custody sometime in 1932 or 1933, his health damaged but intact enough to travel. He made his way back to Moscow through Shanghai and the Soviet Union's eastern territories, arriving in the Soviet capital having been, officially speaking, dead for some time. The Comintern was aware he was alive. The French colonial administration was not yet sure. Moscow in the early and mid-1930s was not a comfortable place for foreign communists. The Stalinist purges were beginning to gather momentum, and the internal logic of those purges, which treated political deviation and foreign connection as presumptive evidence of betrayal, was particularly dangerous for people whose revolutionary careers had involved extensive, independent operation in Asia. Several of Ho's Vietnamese comrades and associates from the Paris and Canton years were caught in the purge machinery during this period. Some were imprisoned. Some disappeared entirely. He survived. partly through the careful management of his political profile, partly through luck, and partly because he was less prominent within the Comintern's internal hierarchy than some of the people who were targeted. He studied at the Lenin School, he wrote. He waited. He was, for several years, kept at a certain distance from the major decisions of the Comintern, trusted enough to be used for occasional assignments, not trusted enough, in the increasingly paranoid atmosphere of the late 1930s, to be given major responsibility. For a man who had been building revolutionary organizations since 1925, the period of enforced patience was its own kind of test. What sustained him during these years, by any reasonable reading of the biographical evidence, was not ideology as an abstraction. It was the specificity of the goal, Vietnam. Not world revolution in a general sense, not the vindication of a theory, but the concrete end of French colonial administration in the country where he had been born. Everything else, the Comintern work, the Marxist framework, the international connections, was instrumental to that. He had never been confused about this, even in the years when stating it too plainly would have been organizationally inconvenient. By the late 1930s, events outside his control were beginning to reorganize the landscape. Japan was moving aggressively through China. Europe was sliding toward another general war. The conditions that had kept Vietnamese anti-colonial organizing in a kind of suspended, underground state for the better part of a decade were about to change in ways that neither the French nor the Japanese fully understood, and that Ho Chi Minh, still operating under various names, still officially dead in French colonial records, had been preparing for longer than anyone else. Japan arrives, and so does the Viet Minh. In June of 1940, France fell. German forces had swept through the Low Countries and into France in under 6 weeks. The French government collapsed, and the armistice that followed produced the Vichy regime, a French state that collaborated with Germany and retained nominal authority over France's overseas empire. For French Indochina, this produced an arrangement of considerable practical strangeness. Japan had already been pressing on the colony from the north, using the war in China as leverage to demand military access to Vietnamese territory. With France defeated and the Vichy administration in no position to refuse, Japan extracted what it wanted: the right to station troops in Indochina, to use Vietnamese ports and airfields, and to treat the colony as a staging base for its operations in Southeast Asia. The French colonial administration remained in place, continuing to collect taxes and run the day-to-day machinery of colonial government. Japan was running a parallel occupation on top of it. 2 separate authorities occupied the same territory, one French, one Japanese, and the Vietnamese population lived underneath both of them. This was, from the perspective of Vietnamese anti-colonial organizing, an unusual moment. The French were still there, still extracting resources and suppressing dissent with their familiar methods. But they were also visibly compromised a colonial administration that had lost its metropolitan government to German occupation and was now operating under Japanese supervision. The prestige that colonial authority depends on for its smooth functioning had been damaged in ways that were impossible to fully repair. Ho Chi Minh had moved back toward Vietnam's borders in 1938, positioning himself in southern China and the mountainous regions of Yunnan province as the situation in Asia deteriorated. He was watching closely and communicating with Vietnamese comrades who were organizing inside the country. By early 1941, he judged that the time had come to go back. He crossed the Chinese border into Vietnam in early February of 1941, somewhere in the northern mountains of Cao Bang province. It had been approximately 30 years since he left Saigon on that French ocean liner. He established a base in a cave called Pac Bo, deep in the limestone karst hills near the Chinese border, a defensible, remote location that the French colonial administration's reach barely extended to. He named the small stream that ran near the cave Lenin Creek, and the mountain above it Karl Marx Mountain, which suggests that even in the midst of organizing a clandestine revolutionary movement in the Vietnamese jungle, he maintained a fairly consistent sense of how to mark his surroundings. Whether the local Tay ethnic minority population who lived in those hills shared his enthusiasm for these geographical designations is not recorded. He was living in a cave, writing by lamplight, eating whatever the surrounding villagers and comrades could provide, and convening meetings that would determine the organizational structure of the Vietnamese revolutionary movement for the next generation. Before moving further into what happened at those meetings, it is worth pausing briefly to describe the world that the Viet Minh was being built inside. Vietnamese colonial society in the early 1940s was stratified in ways that were both rigid and visible. At the top sat the French colonial population administrators, military officers, plantation owners, merchants, a community of roughly 40,000 Europeans in a country of around 20 million, who lived in a material condition entirely different from the population around them. They occupied the modern quarters of cities like Hanoi and Saigon, dined in French restaurants, dressed in European clothing, and moved through Vietnamese cities with the spatial confidence of people who did not share the sidewalks equally. Their children attended separate schools. Their legal rights under the colonial system were categorically different from those of Vietnamese subjects. Below them in the colonial hierarchy sat the Vietnamese educated and professional class, the mandarins, scholars, lawyers, doctors, and merchants who had navigated colonial society well enough to attain a degree of material stability. They wore a mixture of traditional Vietnamese clothing, the áo dai for women, long gowns and turbans for older scholars on formal occasions, and Western dress for professional settings. They ate rice-based meals at home: pho, bun, ban cuon, fermented fish sauces, fresh herbs and vegetables grown in the delta. They lived in respectable townhouses, educated their children at the better colonial schools, and occupied a social position that was genuinely ambiguous, respected within Vietnamese society, formally subordinate within the colonial system, and frequently aware of both. The great majority of the population were peasant farmers. They lived in villages of thatched or tile-roofed houses, grew rice in paddies that had been worked by their families for generations, and wore simple cotton clothing, black trousers and white or indigo shirts, conical non-la hats against the sun. They ate what the harvest provided, supplemented by vegetables, eggs, pork on festival days, and fish sauce on everything. Their lives were organized around the agricultural calendar, the village communal hall, and the obligations, taxes, corvée labor, rent to absentee landlords that had accumulated under French colonialism, on top of the traditional obligations that had existed before it. Between the harvest cycles, there was rarely enough, and in bad years, not enough at all. In the cities, a small industrial and service working class had developed around the French colonial economy workers in textile mills, coal mines, rubber plantations, railways, and the domestic service industry. They earned wages but had no labor protections and no political representation. Vietnamese plantation workers in the rubber estates of Cochinchina worked under conditions that labor investigators, including French ones, occasionally described with open discomfort. This was the society Ho Chi Minh was trying to organize. In May of 1941, from Pac Bo Cave, he convened the 8th plenum of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party and formally established the Vietnam, Doc Lap, Dong Minh Hoi, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The name was deliberately chosen. The organization was framed not as a communist party but as a broad national front, open to anyone who wanted French colonialism and Japanese occupation to end, regardless of their class or political background. The communist leadership structure was there, but it operated within a nationalist framework designed to have the widest possible appeal. Ho had learned enough from Canton and the intervening years to understand that a movement that presented itself primarily as ideologically communist would alienate the peasant majority and the educated nationalist middle class that it needed. The Viet Minh, as the organization was universally called, was something that could recruit a village farmer and a Confucian scholar and a socialist intellectual all into the same organization, without requiring any of them to describe themselves as a communist first. In August of 1942, he crossed back into China to coordinate with the Chinese resistance forces and ran directly into bad luck. Chinese nationalist Kuomintang soldiers arrested him in Guangxi province under suspicion of being a French spy. He spent approximately 14 months in Chinese nationalist prisons, moving through more than 30 different detention facilities as his captors tried to decide what exactly he was and what to do with him. The conditions were poor, the treatment variable, and his health suffered. He was released in September of 1943, having negotiated his way out partly through the intervention of a Chinese general who concluded he might be more useful outside the prison system than inside it. While he had been imprisoned, General Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher from Nghệ An, who had been recruited into the revolutionary movement and who would go on to become one of the most capable military commanders of the 20th century, had been expanding the Viet Minh's armed forces in the northern Vietnamese mountains. The guerrilla infrastructure that would eventually fight two major wars was being assembled patiently and with limited resources in the highland terrain that colonial administration had never fully controlled. In March of 1945, Japan made a decision that changed everything. Operation Mago, the Japanese military coup against the French colonial administration in Indochina, was executed in a single night. Japanese forces disarmed and imprisoned the French colonial military and administration across the country in a coordinated overnight action. The French presence in Indochina, which had endured for the better part of a century, was eliminated in approximately 12 hours. A puppet Vietnamese emperor, Bao Dai, was installed to provide the appearance of Vietnamese sovereignty under Japanese supervision. The coup removed the French entirely from the equation for the first time in living memory. It also created the power vacuum that Ho Chi Minh had been, with considerable patience, waiting for. August Revolution, a nation declares itself. The famine that swept through northern Vietnam in the winter and spring of 1944 and 1945 was the direct consequence of two overlapping policies operating simultaneously. The Japanese military was requisitioning rice to feed its forces and to produce fuel. The Vichy French colonial administration was taxing rice production and redirecting stocks for its own needs. The peasant farmers of the Red River Delta, caught between these two extractive systems during a year when flooding and drought had already damaged harvests, began to starve. The estimates of the dead vary considerably in the historical record, but the figures that appear most frequently in serious scholarship range from around 400,000 to 2 million people, which means that even the most conservative count represents a catastrophe of the first order. Bodies appeared on roads, villages emptied. People walked south and west towards cities, carrying nothing, looking for food that was not there either. The famine ended only when the next harvest came in the summer of 1945. By then, the political landscape had already been transformed by events that moved far faster than food relief. The Viet Minh had been supplying intelligence to the American Office of Strategic Services, the wartime American intelligence service, since the early months of 1945. The Americans needed information about Japanese troop movements in Indochina, rescue assistance for downed American pilots, and a reliable partner on the ground in a region where they had very limited visibility. The Viet Minh needed weapons, supplies, and the political legitimacy that came from being recognized as a useful ally by the United States. The arrangement suited both sides well enough that a small American team, including an OSS officer named Archimedes Patty, was parachuted into the Viet Minh's base area in the Northern Highlands. Ho Chi Minh met with these Americans, made a favorable impression, presented himself consistently as a nationalist fighting occupation rather than a communist building a revolutionary state, and received weapons and a degree of personal medical attention. He was ill with malaria and possibly other conditions during this period from the American team. The collaboration was real, limited, and consequential in ways that neither side fully understood at the time. On the 6th of August, 1945, an American bomber dropped an atomic weapon on Hiroshima. On the 9th of August, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On the 15th of August, Japan announced its surrender to the Allied powers. The Second World War was over. The Japanese military presence in Vietnam, still armed and still physically occupying the country, was now awaiting formal surrender to Allied forces yet to arrive. The power vacuum created by those few days in August was exactly what Ho Chi Minh had spent 30 years preparing for. He had perhaps a week, possibly less, before Allied forces arrived to receive the Japanese surrender, before the French began serious efforts to reassert their colonial authority, and before any rival Vietnamese political organization could organize itself effectively enough to contest the moment. The Viet Minh moved. Pre-positioned Viet Minh cadres in cities and provinces across the country had been preparing for precisely this scenario. On the 19th of August, Viet Minh forces and their supporters marched on Hanoi, the governor's palace, the treasury, the police headquarters, and other key administrative buildings were seized in a day of demonstrations and organizational assertiveness that the Japanese garrison formally surrendered but still present did not contest. The crowds that turned out in Hanoi that day were enormous, drawing people from surrounding rural areas as well as the city itself. The yellow star on red field flagged the Viet Minh's banner, which would become the flag of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, was raised over the governor's palace. The same process repeated itself across the country with remarkable speed. Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon all saw Viet Minh demonstrations and administrative seizures within days. The Japanese garrison offered no resistance. The Vichy French administration, stripped of its Japanese protectors, had no practical means to respond. The colonial machinery of French Indochina, which had operated continuously for the better part of 60 years, stopped functioning in the space of a week. Bao Dai, the last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty, abdicated on the 25th of August. He had been installed as a puppet by the Japanese after their coup in March, and his position without Japanese backing was simply not tenable. He issued an abdication proclamation and, in a moment that carried considerable symbolic weight, handed over his imperial seal and sword to Viet Minh representatives, a formal, visible transfer of Vietnamese imperial legitimacy to the new government. He would later accept a nominal advisory role in Ho Chi Minh's government before eventually collaborating with the French. But in that moment of abdication, the 900-year tradition of Vietnamese imperial governance formally concluded. Ho Chi Minh entered Hanoi. He was 55 years old, thin and visibly unwell from the malaria and other ailments that had accumulated over decades of living in difficult conditions. The city he was entering as the leader of a newly declared government was one he had left as a kitchen assistant 40 years earlier. He had not seen it in all that time. On the 2nd of September, 1945, he appeared before approximately 500,000 people gathered in Ba Ding Square in the center of Hanoi. The Viet Minh's 5,000 armed fighters were arranged in formations around the square. Representatives of the Allied powers were present, including the American OSS officers. The crowd stretched further than anyone could see clearly from the platform. He began reading from a document he had written himself. The opening lines were immediately recognizable to anyone who had encountered the founding literature of Western democratic thought. He read, "All men are created equal." He read that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights among them: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He attributed these lines to their source, the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. He then cited the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from 1791, the same document that the French Republic had been citing as the foundation of its own legitimacy for more than a century. The strategy was deliberate and precisely calculated. He was turning the founding documents of the two most significant Western powers of the moment against the colonial system those powers had built and maintained. He was saying, in the clearest possible language, that if these principles were real, then Vietnamese independence was not a political demand but a logical consequence. He was also, very specifically, addressing the American audience. The United States was at that moment the dominant Allied power, and whether America would support or oppose French recolonization of Vietnam would be among the most consequential questions of the coming months. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed from that platform. He read the full text of the declaration and presented the new government to its first citizens. The crowd, by all accounts, was very large and very quiet for most of the reading, and very loud at its conclusion. The OSS officer Archimedes Patty, standing in the crowd, reportedly described the moment as one of genuine emotional force, a small, thin man in a plain tunic, reading a document that drew on the founding principles of the American Republic before 500,000 people in a country that had been a French colony for the entire span of living memory. Whether Washington would respond to the appeal embedded in those opening lines was another matter entirely. The signals were not encouraging. The Roosevelt administration had occasionally expressed skepticism about European colonialism in Asia, but Roosevelt was dead, Truman was in office, and the priority of maintaining the French alliance in a post-war Europe was already beginning to outweigh any American discomfort with French imperial ambitions. The French were already planning their return. British forces under General Douglas Gracie had arrived in Saigon in the south, and Gracie, operating with the Allied mandate to receive Japanese surrender in the southern zone, made decisions that would help the French re-establish their presence. Chinese nationalist forces were moving into the north to receive the Japanese surrender in their zone. The new Democratic Republic of Vietnam held the center of the country and the declaration it had just made, and was surrounded on all sides by powers with interests that did not necessarily include its survival. The celebration in Ba Dinh Square was real and earned. It was also very brief. Fighting France. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam that Ho Chi Minh proclaimed in September of 1945 was a government in possession of considerable popular support and very little else. It had no formal international recognition from any major power. It had a small armed force, limited weapons, and an economy shattered by years of war, occupation, and famine. It controlled the north and center of the country in a practical sense, but the south was already slipping away. British forces under General Douglas Gracie, operating in Saigon with a mandate to receive the Japanese surrender in southern Vietnam, made a decision in late September of 1945 to rearm French colonial troops who had been imprisoned by the Japanese and to allow French forces to reassert control of the city. Within weeks of the Ba Dinh Square declaration, French soldiers were back in the streets of Saigon. Ho Chi Minh chose, in those first months, to negotiate rather than fight immediately. The choice was not reluctant, it was calculated. The Viet Minh was not yet strong enough to defeat a rearmed French military, and buying time to build forces while exploring what diplomacy could achieve was strategically sound. In March of 1946, he signed a preliminary agreement with France that recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, while allowing French troops to return to northern Vietnam temporarily. His colleagues in the Viet Minh were divided about the agreement. Some considered it a betrayal of the independence they had just declared. He argued, in terms that were blunt and unsentimental, that it was preferable to fight the Chinese nationalist forces currently occupying the north while simultaneously fighting the French in the south, which was the alternative, or to wait until the Viet Minh was stronger. The troops could come back, he said. If the Chinese stayed, they would stay forever. The argument was not entirely popular, but it prevailed. The Fontainebleau Conference, held outside Paris in the summer of 1946, was the formal negotiation between the DRV and France over what the relationship between Vietnam and the French Union would actually look like. Ho attended personally. The French delegation, operating under considerable domestic political pressure to maintain French imperial prestige in the post-war world, was not willing to offer anything approaching genuine independence. The conference failed. He signed a weak modus vivendi, a temporary arrangement, and returned to Vietnam having achieved very little at the negotiating table. The situation in Vietnam had continued deteriorating while the talks were happening. French forces and Viet Minh forces were clashing at a low level throughout the country. The incidents accumulated. On the 23rd of November, 1946, the French Navy bombarded the port city of Haiphong following a dispute over customs control. The civilian death toll in Haiphong from that bombardment has been estimated by French military sources themselves at approximately 6,000 people. It may have been higher. The bombardment was not an accident or an impulsive act. It was a deliberate exercise of military force to reassert French authority, ordered by French officials who had decided that the negotiating period was over. Ho Chi Minh sent letters to French Prime Minister Léon Blum and to President Harry Truman, appealing for intervention or at least pressure on France to stop. Neither responded with anything actionable. Truman's administration, watching the emerging Cold War in Europe and increasingly anxious about communist expansion globally, was not inclined to pressure France over its colonial policy in Asia. The French were an essential ally in Western Europe. Vietnam was, to Washington in 1946, a secondary concern. On the night of the 19th of December, 1946, the Viet Minh struck French military installations across Hanoi simultaneously. Power stations were attacked. French soldiers were killed in their quarters. The First Indochina War had begun. The Viet Minh could not hold Hanoi. French military forces were better armed, better supplied, and had access to artillery and air power that the Viet Minh could not match in any conventional engagement. Ho Chi Minh and his government retreated from the capital into the mountainous Viet Bac region in the north, the same highland territory near the Chinese border where the Viet Minh had organized in the early 1940s. The war would be fought from there, a guerrilla conflict in terrain that heavily favored defenders who knew it, against a French army that was numerically superior in the cities and along the major roads, but consistently vulnerable outside them. The nature of that war, over the 8 years that followed, was brutal on both sides and unrelenting on all fronts. French forces held the main population centres and attempted to extend their control through a network of fortified posts across the Delta and Highland regions. The Viet Minh avoided conventional battles when French firepower would be decisive, moved through jungle and mountain trails with knowledge that French soldiers simply did not have, and built its popular support base methodically through political education, taxation, and local administration in the areas it controlled. Giap's forces grew steadily in both size and capability. The French killed a great many Viet Minh fighters and a great many Vietnamese civilians in operations across the country. The Viet Minh killed a great many French soldiers and a great many Vietnamese collaborators. It was not a clean war, and no serious account of it has ever suggested otherwise. The international situation shifted dramatically in October of 1949, when Mao Zedong's communist forces completed their victory in the Chinese Civil War and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. For the First Indochina War, this was an event of immediate strategic significance. China now shared a border with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and Mao's government was prepared to provide weapons, training, and material support to the Viet Minh. In January of 1950, China formally recognized the DRV. The Soviet Union did the same days later. The Viet Minh, which had been fighting for 3 years with captured weapons and what it could manufacture itself, suddenly had access to a supply line. The United States responded to the Chinese Communist victory by dramatically increasing its support for France in Indochina. By May of 1950, American military and economic aid was flowing to the French war effort, not American soldiers. At that stage, but money and equipment in quantities that would eventually make the United States the primary financier of the French campaign. Washington framed the Indochina War as part of the global struggle against communist expansion, particularly after the Korean War began in June of 1950. Ho Chi Minh had spent years presenting the Viet Minh as a nationalist movement. The American decision to cast it primarily as a communist one, and to treat the French colonial war as therefore a Cold War front, would have consequences that extended far beyond the years in which the French were still fighting. In the autumn of 1950, the Viet Minh launched a series of coordinated attacks along the Vietnamese-Chinese border that shattered French defensive positions and caused some of the heaviest French military losses of the war. The border campaign opened the supply route from China and demonstrated that Giap's forces had developed from a guerrilla movement into something capable of sustained offensive military operations against prepared French positions. France sent its best general, Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, to take command in December of 1950. De Lattre was an energetic and capable commander who stabilized French positions, won several significant engagements in early 1951, and constructed a line of fortified concrete bunkers, the De Lattre Line, across the northern delta to protect the Red River region. His arrival gave the French campaign a new urgency and competence that it had been lacking. He also died of cancer in January of 1952, before the line he had built could be properly tested by the Viet Minh's evolving capabilities. By 1952 and into 1953, the French public was increasingly weary. The war had been running for 6 years. It was consuming French soldiers at a rate that metropolitan France found difficult to sustain politically, and the strategic objective, a pacified Indochina restored to colonial normalcy, seemed no closer than it had been in 1946. French governments changed regularly during this period, and each new government inherited a war that no one had a clear plan to finish. The French military high command was developing a plan, however. The idea was to create a major fortified base deep in Viet Minh territory, a base large enough and strong enough to force Giap into a conventional battle that French firepower would decisively win. In November of 1953, French paratroopers dropped into a remote valley in the mountains of northwestern Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu and began building that base. It was, in retrospect, a significant miscalculation. Dien Bien Phu. The valley of Dien Bien Phu was approximately 16 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide, set in the mountains of northwestern Vietnam near the Laotian border. It had a small airstrip, a river, a scattering of villages, and hills on all sides that rose steeply above the valley floor. The French General Staff looked at this geography in the autumn of 1953 and concluded it was ideal for what they had in mind. The plan, approved by General Henri Navarre, was to create a fortified garrison large enough to serve as an offensive base for operations against Viet Minh supply lines into Laos, and simultaneously large enough to draw Giap's main forces into a set-piece battle where French firepower artillery, aircraft, and the well-supplied, well-trained garrison itself would destroy them. The French called this concept the hedgehog. The idea was that the Viet Minh could not ignore such a base in their territory, would be compelled to attack it, and would be defeated when they did. On the 22nd of November, 1953, French paratroopers dropped into the valley in an operation called Castor and began building. The garrison that assembled over the following months was among the best France had available. Foreign Legion units, paratroopers, Moroccan and Algerian infantry, Vietnamese auxiliaries at its maximum strength. The force numbered somewhere between 10,000 and 16,000 men, depending on which reinforcement phase is counted. The individual strongpoints around the perimeter were assigned names from a list that reportedly included several names belonging to the mistress of the French garrison commander, which at minimum reflects an unusual approach to military nomenclature and may explain why French commanders in that era sometimes seemed more attached to their defensive positions than strictly professional considerations required. Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Huguette, Claudine, Dominique, Eliane, Isabel. Each was a fortified hill position, ringed with barbed wire, bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire. The fundamental assumption on which the entire plan rested was that the Viet Minh could not bring heavy artillery to the surrounding hills in meaningful quantity. The hills were steep. The jungle was dense. The distances from Viet Minh supply lines were considerable. French military planners had assessed the logistics of moving large-caliber guns through that terrain and had concluded it was beyond the Viet Minh's practical capability. Their own artillery commander, Colonel Charles Piroth, was reportedly confident that whatever guns Giap managed to bring up could be quickly neutralized by French counter-battery fire. Giap had a different assessment of what was possible. Starting in late 1953, he began moving approximately 50,000 civilian laborers, the Dan Cong, the People's Transport Workers, into the mountains around Dien Bien Phu. They came from provinces across northern Vietnam, mostly peasant farmers conscripted into the war effort. What they were asked to do was disassemble artillery pieces, including Soviet and Chinese-supplied 105mm howitzers and anti-aircraft guns, and move the components through jungle trails by hand. Wheels were removed. Barrels were lashed to wooden beams. Groups of men hauled pieces up slopes that had no roads, through forest that offered no clear path, across terrain that French military engineers had looked at and declared impassable for heavy equipment. The process took weeks. The weapons arrived. They were installed in the hillsides facing the French positions, dug into the earth with protective revetments that shielded them from air attack, positioned with careful attention to their fields of fire and to the cover available from the surrounding terrain. The French garrison in the valley, going about its daily business and waiting for the attack it intended to repel, was surrounded by a ring of artillery it did not know was there, in those quantities or in those positions. The siege began on the 13th of March, 1954. The first targets were the outer strongpoints. Beatrice fell in the first night, overrun by Viet Minh infantry following a concentrated artillery barrage that the French had neither anticipated in its intensity nor been able to suppress. Gabrielle fell the following day. Anne-Marie, whose garrison included Thai auxiliary troops with limited investment in fighting to the last for the French cause, was abandoned shortly after. Colonel Piroth, who had guaranteed that his guns would silence the Viet Minh artillery and who found himself instead unable to locate, reach, or suppress the dug-in Viet Minh gun positions that were systematically destroying the French perimeter, took his own life on the 15th of March. He had told colleagues he felt personally responsible. The French guns in the valley were exposed on the flat ground. The Viet Minh guns in the hills were buried in the earth. The tactical asymmetry was not something that counter-battery fire could resolve. The French High Command appealed to the United States for direct military intervention. American military planners, including some within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, developed plans for massive American airstrikes, potentially including the use of tactical nuclear weapons, a proposal that circulated seriously enough that it required a direct refusal rather than simple dismissal. President Eisenhower declined to intervene militarily. He was privately skeptical of the French campaign's strategic competence and publicly concerned about the American public's appetite for another Asian war so soon after Korea. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, explored the possibility of a joint Anglo-American air intervention with the British government. The British declined. Operation Vulture, as the American airstrike plan was called, was shelved. The Viet Minh pressed the siege through March and April. Giap's approach combined direct infantry assaults on individual strongpoints with a methodical program of trench construction. A network of approach trenches dug progressively closer to the French perimeter, shortening the ground that had to be crossed under fire during each assault and tightening the noose around the garrison's surviving positions. French aircraft continued to fly in reinforcements and supplies through anti-aircraft fire that grew increasingly effective as the Viet Minh brought more guns to bear on the airstrip and approach corridors. The airstrip itself was rendered unusable early in the siege, which meant that all resupply had to come by parachute drop into a shrinking perimeter, much of which fell into Viet Minh hands. The strong points fell in sequence through April and into May. French paratroopers continued to be dropped into the valley as reinforcement throughout the siege, a decision whose operational logic was, in retrospect, difficult to defend, since it delivered trained soldiers into an encirclement from which they could not escape rather than preserving them for operations elsewhere. The garrison fought with considerable tenacity. Individual French and Foreign Legion units conducted counterattacks and defensive stands that cost the Viet Minh significant casualties. Giap's losses were heavy throughout, estimated at around 8,000 dead and 15,000 wounded by the end of the siege. The costs of the victory were not borne lightly. On the evening of the 7th of May, 1954, Viet Minh forces overran the French command bunker. The garrison commander, General Christian de Castries, was taken prisoner. The white flags went up across the surviving strong points. Approximately 11,000 French and Allied soldiers entered captivity. Of those, roughly half would die in Viet Minh prison camps from illness and the difficult conditions of the forced marches north that followed. The Geneva Conference, convened to settle the Korean War and the Indochina situation, had opened on the 26th of April before the battle ended. The fall of Dien Bien Phu on the 7th of May arrived as the delegates were still settling in. Its timing could not have been more precisely calibrated to shape the negotiations, though the timing was a product of military necessity rather than diplomatic choreography. The French negotiating position at Geneva had just been altered, in the most direct way possible, by events on the ground. In France, the political impact was immediate. The Indochina War had been deeply unpopular for years, and Dien Bien Phu supplied the image and the finality that public opinion required. Pierre Mendès France became Prime Minister in June of 1954 on an explicit promise to end the war within 30 days. He meant it. The era of French military presence in Vietnam was ending. The era of American military involvement was not yet fully visible, but it was already beginning to take shape in the offices of people who believed that what France had lost was recoverable, provided the right power took France's place. Geneva and a divided nation. The Geneva Conference had been called to address two separate Asian conflicts, the Korean War and the situation in Indochina, and it convened in the Swiss city on the 26th of April, 1954. The French were there, exhausted and looking for an exit. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam sent its foreign minister, Pham Van Dong, who had been among Ho Chi Minh's closest colleagues since the Canton years. The British, Soviet, Chinese, and American delegations were present as the major powers. The Bao Dai government, the French-backed state of Vietnam that claimed to represent southern Vietnam, sent its own delegation. Cambodia and Laos had representatives as well. The atmosphere around the table was shaped entirely by what was happening in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, 4,000 kilometers away. When the conference opened, the garrison was still holding. When it fell on the 7th of May, the balance shifted. The French negotiators were no longer bargaining from a position of military credibility. They needed an agreement, and they needed it soon. Pierre Mendès France had promised his parliament a settlement by the 20th of July, and he kept his deadline. The central figure on the DRV side was not Ho Chi Minh himself, who remained in Hanoi, but Pham Van Dong, a quiet, precise man from Quang Ngai province, whose negotiating posture combined firmness on the essential point of Vietnamese sovereignty with a flexibility on timing and mechanism that reflected the political pressures the DRV was operating under. Those pressures were considerable and came from unexpected directions. Both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were pressing the DRV to accept a temporary partition rather than pushing for complete and immediate reunification. The Chinese, who had been instrumental in the Viet Minh's military build-up had their own calculations about regional stability and American military escalation. Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister, played an active role in the negotiations and was a persistent voice for compromise on the partition question. The Soviet Union, under Molotov's representation at Geneva, was similarly interested in a settlement that did not risk drawing the United States into another direct Asian military engagement. The DRV accepted terms that were, on their face, less than complete victory, but more than anything the situation had offered 3 months earlier. The Geneva Accords, finalized on the 21st of July, 1954, established a ceasefire, required French forces to withdraw from Vietnam, and divided the country at the 17th parallel into 2 temporary zones. The division was explicitly not a political boundary. The agreement stated clearly that the demarcation line was a military ceasefire line and not in any sense a territorial or political border. Nationwide elections to reunify Vietnam were to be held in July of 1956, 2 years away. The Accords also provided a 300-day period during which civilians could move freely between the 2 zones. The population movement that followed was the largest in Vietnamese history to that point. Approximately 900,000 people, the great majority of them Vietnamese Catholics, moved south. Many were responding to genuine fears about life under a communist government. Many were also responding to an active and well-funded campaign organized partly by the American CIA officer Edward Lansdale, who was operating in Saigon and who ran operations specifically designed to encourage Catholic migration and to spread alarm about conditions in the north. The migration genuinely reshaped the demographic and political character of the South and became the foundation of Ngo Dinh Diem's political base. Moving in the opposite direction were the Viet Minh fighters and political cadres who had been operating in southern and central Vietnam during the war. The agreements required the Viet Minh to regroup its military forces north of the 17th parallel. The majority went, but not everyone. An estimated 5,000 to 10,000 cadres remained in the south, buried in local communities, maintaining their organizational networks and waiting to see what the elections of 1956 would produce. They were known as the regroupees. Their presence would become critically important within a few years. The United States did not sign the Geneva Accords. The Eisenhower administration had observed the conference proceedings with considerable skepticism about any agreement that left the DRV intact and set a timetable for Vietnamese reunification under conditions that American officials privately acknowledged would produce a result they did not want. The American delegation at Geneva took note of the Accords rather than endorsing them, which was a diplomatic formulation designed to preserve American freedom of action while not openly sabotaging a settlement the French and British had just negotiated. Ngo Dinh Diem, a Vietnamese Catholic Mandarin who had spent years in exile partly in the United States, had been installed as Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam by the Bao Dai government in June of 1954. He was, from the Eisenhower administration's perspective, the most promising available option for building a viable non-communist Vietnamese state in the South. President Eisenhower wrote to him directly offering American support, making clear that American assistance was contingent on Diem pursuing the reforms necessary to establish popular legitimacy. The relationship between Washington and Saigon that would define the next 2 decades was being assembled, piece by piece, in the months immediately following Geneva. The elections scheduled for July of 1956 never happened. Diem, backed by the United States, refused to participate in any nationwide vote. His reasoning, stated publicly, was that free elections were not possible in the North under the DRV's political system, and that a vote conducted under those conditions would not reflect genuine Vietnamese preferences. The argument had a surface plausibility that diplomatic language could sustain. What gave the refusal its particular historical quality was a remark made in his own memoirs by the American president who supported it. Dwight Eisenhower wrote in a passage that his editors apparently did not consider remarkable enough to remove that he had never spoken with any person knowledgeable about Indochina who did not believe that, had the elections taken place as scheduled, approximately 80% of the Vietnamese population would have voted for Ho Chi Minh. The elections were not held. The reason they were not held was, at least in part, that the likely outcome was known in advance and found unacceptable. This was not a secret. It was published in those exact terms by the American president himself. The Geneva Settlement had been presented to the world as a framework for Vietnamese reunification through democratic means. Within 2 years of its signing, the mechanism it prescribed had been set aside. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north was building its state, consolidating its territory, and noting the failure to hold the promised elections with growing anger. The state of Vietnam in the south, backed by American money and American advisors, was attempting to construct a government capable of surviving without French support in a country where the organization that had just defeated the French remained active, organized, and deeply rooted in the rural population. The partition that the Geneva Accords called temporary was becoming permanent. The question was not whether this would produce another war, but when and under whose management. Ho Chi Minh had accepted the Geneva terms, under pressure from his Chinese and Soviet allies, and with the stated belief that the elections would produce reunification within 2 years. The elections did not come. What came instead was the American involvement he had been trying, with diminishing hope, to prevent since the night in September of 1945, when he stood in Bardin Square and opened his Declaration of Independence with the words of Thomas Jefferson. The next war was not yet formally declared, but its structure was already in place. Uncle Ho builds the North. Hanoi, in the autumn of 1954, was a city adjusting to new management. French civilians were leaving, packing their possessions and their colonial habits into whatever transport was available and making their way to the port. Vietnamese families who had built their lives around the French administrative apparatus were making calculations about whether to stay or go. The last French soldiers were withdrawing as the terms of the Geneva Accords required, and the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which had spent 8 years governing from caves and jungle base camps in the northern highlands, was moving into offices in a city it had not formally controlled since December of 1946. Ho Chi Minh settled into the compound of the former French Governor-General's palace in Hanoi. He did not, however, move into the palace itself. He had a small wooden house built in the palace grounds, modest, simply furnished, with a garden he tended himself. He received foreign dignitaries, held meetings, worked and slept in this house rather than in the grand French colonial building that sat a short distance away. Whether the choice was genuine personal preference or deliberate political symbolism is probably impossible to fully separate, but its effect was clear. It reinforced the image of Ho Chi Minh as a man who lived as the people lived, who had not acquired power in order to live like the colonizers whose buildings he now occupied. He wore plain clothing, a simple grey tunic, rubber sandals made from the treads of used tires, a style that remained consistent through the remaining years of his life and became one of the most recognizable images in the political iconography of the 20th century. The figure that emerged in the 1950s as the public face of North Vietnam was known universally as Bac Ho Uncle Ho. The title was not merely affectionate. It was a carefully cultivated political identity that positioned him as a national patriarch rather than a Revolutionary Party bosswise, accessible, personally disinterested in wealth or comfort, devoted entirely to the country rather than to himself or any faction within it. He wrote simple verses that were published widely, visited schools and work units, received peasants and workers with the manner of a man who considered their concerns more important than his appointments. The persona was real in the sense that the people who knew him personally consistently described these qualities as genuine. It was also a political construction maintained with considerable deliberateness. The government he led was not gentle. The most significant domestic policy of the early DRV years was the Land Reform Campaign, which ran from approximately 1953 through 1956 across the north. The campaign's stated purpose was to redistribute agricultural land from landlords to the peasant farmers who worked it to undo the land concentration that French colonialism and its Vietnamese collaborators had built over generations. This was enormously popular in principle among the rural majority, who had been tenants and labourers on land their families had worked for generations. The implementation was catastrophic. The campaign was organised through village-level people's tribunals, modelled partly on the Chinese land reform that had preceded it, in which neighbours denounced neighbours, accused landlords and class enemies were tried in public meetings, and sentences were handed down by committees with little legal training and considerable political pressure to demonstrate ideological commitment through severity. People were classified as landlords who owned land that by any reasonable standard did not qualify them for the category. Old resentments were settled under the cover of class struggle. The accused had no meaningful right of defence. The death toll from executions carried out under the campaign has been estimated in various historical accounts at between 3,000 and 15,000 people, with the uncertainty itself reflecting the difficulty of research in a country that did not preserve comprehensive records of what happened in those village tribunals. Ho Chi Minh was aware of the campaign and endorsed it as necessary. In 1956, as the scope of the errors became impossible to ignore, partly because of reports coming back from villages, and partly because of the broader de-Stalinization that was occurring across the communist world following Khrushchev's secret speech, he publicly acknowledged that mistakes had been made. He asked forgiveness in terms that were more direct than most communist leaders of his era managed in similar circumstances. A rectification campaign followed, releasing some of those wrongly imprisoned and attempting to restore property to people incorrectly classified as landlords. The damage to families, communities, and individuals was not undone by these acknowledgements, and it left a mark on the DRV's relationship with its own population that persisted for years. The broader economic program of the North in the late 1950s followed a Soviet-style pattern: collectivization of agriculture, state direction of industry, central planning, and the prioritization of heavy industry and infrastructure development. The Soviet Union and China were the DRV's primary aid donors during this period, supplying technical advisors, industrial equipment, and economic support. The North was poor, its infrastructure damaged by years of war, and the task of building a functional modern economy while simultaneously preparing for the conflict that the failure of the 1956 elections made increasingly inevitable, consumed enormous state energy. The limits of political expression in the North became visible in the Nan Van and GI Pham affair of 1955 to 1958, a brief intellectual flowering in which Vietnamese writers, poets, and intellectuals, emboldened by the de-Stalinization current moving through the communist world, published work that was critical of party control over cultural life and called for greater creative and political freedom. The party shut it down. The publications were banned, and their contributors were subjected to criticism campaigns, reduced to marginal positions, and in some cases imprisoned or sent to re-education. The message was clear. The DRV was a state with a specific political direction, and intellectual activity that challenged that direction would not be accommodated. Within the party, a debate about the South was running in parallel to all of this domestic construction. The Geneva Accords had required the Viet Minh's southern cadres to regroup to the north, and the party's formal position in the years immediately following Geneva was that reunification would come through political means. This position was challenged with increasing force by the Southern Party members and cadres who had stayed behind in the South, people who were watching Ngo Dinh Diem's government systematically arrest, imprison, and execute former Viet Minh and their families under legislation that made communist association a capital offence. Diem's law, 10 of 1959 established military tribunals that could sentence suspected communists to death with minimal procedural constraint. The southern cadres were being destroyed while waiting for political resolution that was not coming. Le Duan, a southerner by origin, a man who had spent years in Diem's prisons, and who had a harder and more operationally aggressive instinct than Ho Chi Minh's more cautious international positioning, became the most important advocate within the party for armed struggle in the South. He travelled to the South in 1958, assessed the situation directly, and returned to Hanoi with conclusions that shaped the party's strategic direction for the following decade. In 1959, the party formally authorized the resumption of armed resistance in the South. A military unit designated Group 559 was established and tasked with opening supply routes southward through Laos routes that would eventually become known to the world as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In January of 1960, Le Duan became General Secretary of the Vietnam Workers' Party, the most powerful operational position in the DRV's political structure. Ho Chi Minh remained president and the face of the government, but the day-to-day direction of the party's strategy was increasingly Le Duan's domain. Ho was 69 years old and his health had been declining since the 40s. The figure of Uncle Ho remained central to the DRV's political identity and its ability to mobilize popular commitment, but the man behind the image was governing with diminishing physical capacity. In December of 1960, the National Liberation Front was formally established in the South, a broad coalition organization, modeled deliberately on the Viet Minh's approach, designed to give the Southern resistance a political structure that extended beyond the Communist Party membership. The DRV supported it and guided it, while presenting it publicly as an autonomous Southern movement. The Americans called it the Viet Cong. The war that the Geneva Accords had been intended to prevent was now, by every meaningful measure, underway. America steps into the quicksand. Ngo Dinh Diem had governed the Republic of Vietnam in the South since 1954 with a combination of genuine nationalist conviction and an increasingly narrow political tolerance. He was Catholic in a country where the Catholic minority represented roughly 10% of the population. He governed through a network of family loyalists. His brother Ngo Dinh Nhu ran the feared secret police, and Nhu's wife, the famously combative Madame Nhu, served as an unofficial spokesperson whose public comments tended to complicate American diplomatic management of the Saigon government. Diem's approach to the communist insurgency was to apply maximum political and security pressure, arresting, imprisoning, and executing suspected NLF members and their networks, including people who had no communist affiliation but fell into the broad categories that his security apparatus had defined as subversive. The Strategic Hamlet Program, developed with American advisory input in 1962, attempted to separate the rural population from NLF influence by physically relocating peasants from their ancestral villages into fortified compounds. The program displaced people from land their families had worked for generations, generated deep resentment in the countryside, and produced security statistics that looked encouraging in Saigon and Washington without reflecting any actual reduction in NLF organizational strength in the villages. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 exposed the extent of Diem's isolation from his own population. When government forces fired on crowds in Hue celebrating the Buddha's birthday in May of that year, the resulting protests spread across the country. Buddhist monks began burning themselves to death in public acts that were photographed and transmitted around the world, placing the Saigon government's character on permanent visual record. Madame Nhu described these self-immolations as barbecues, which communicated something useful about the government's political instincts. The Kennedy administration, which had increased the American military advisory presence in South Vietnam from around 900 advisors it had inherited to approximately 16,000, was deeply uncomfortable with Diem but uncertain about alternatives. That uncertainty resolved itself in November of 1963, when South Vietnamese military officers, with the knowledge and tacit consent of American officials including the new ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, mounted a coup against Diem. Diem and his brother Nu were captured on the 2nd of November 1963 and shot in the back of an armoured personnel carrier while supposedly being transported to custody. Washington had not explicitly authorized their killing. It had authorized the coup that made their killing possible, which is a distinction that has been discussed by historians with varying conclusions about its moral significance. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson inherited a war that had already consumed 9 years of American involvement, approximately 16,000 American military personnel on the ground, and a client government in Saigon that had just murdered its own leader with American encouragement and was now cycling through a succession of military juntas with no stable political base. Johnson's instinct, formed by his experience of the political consequences of the Chinese Communist victory in 1949 and the McCarthy era that followed, was that no democratic president could afford to be the one who lost Vietnam. He escalated. The mechanism that provided the legal authorization for that escalation was the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964. On the 2nd of August, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the American destroyer USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, in a genuine engagement prompted partly by covert South Vietnamese operations in the area that the Maddox had been supporting. On the 4th of August, the Johnson administration reported a second North Vietnamese attack on American vessels. The second attack almost certainly did not happen. The radar contacts and apparent torpedo tracks that American commanders reported that night were most likely false returns caused by weather conditions and nervous operators. The ship's commanders themselves sent messages expressing serious doubt about what they had detected. Johnson presented the second incident to the American public and Congress as a confirmed act of aggression and used it to secure passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on the 7th of August, a congressional authorization that gave the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It passed the Senate 88-2. The bombing of North Vietnam began in earnest in March of 1965, under the name Operation Rolling Thunder. The operation would continue, with brief pauses, for 3 years, one of the longest sustained aerial bombardment campaigns in the history of warfare. The targets included military installations, supply routes, bridges, fuel depots, and industrial facilities across the north. The DRV moved factories underground, dispersed critical infrastructure, rebuilt what was destroyed with labor, mobilized from across the country, and continued functioning as a state under conditions that American planners had expected would compel negotiation within weeks. On the 8th of March, 1965, the 1st American ground combat troops, 3,500 Marines, waded ashore at Da Nang. They were the first of hundreds of thousands. General William Westmoreland, commanding American forces in Vietnam, pursued a strategy built around attrition finding and destroying NLF and North Vietnamese Army units at a rate that would exceed their ability to replace losses, reaching the crossover point at which the enemy's capacity for sustained combat would be exhausted. The strategy required killing enemy soldiers faster than they could be recruited and trained. Westmoreland measured progress by body counts, and the body counts that came back from the field were impressive. Whether they accurately reflected the actual strategic situation was a question that took several years to answer definitively. American troop numbers climbed steeply. By the end of 1965, there were approximately 184,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, the number had grown to 385,000. By late 1967, it approached 500,000. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara applied the quantitative management methods that had made him successful in the automobile industry to the problem of Vietnam, generating elaborate data systems that measured everything measurable sortie rates, Hamlet evaluations, kill ratios, weapons captured, and that consistently produced indicators suggesting the war was being won. The gap between the indicators and the reality on the ground was discussed in private by a growing number of American military officers and officials who had spent time in Vietnam, and was not reflected in the briefings delivered in Washington. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply network running south through Laos and Cambodia that Group 559 had begun building in 1959, had developed by the mid-1960s into an extensive logistics system. It was not a single road, but a web of paths, roads, rivers, and rest stations running through triple-canopy jungle terrain that American aircraft found extraordinarily difficult to interdict. American bombing of the trail dropped enormous quantities of ordnance on Laotian and Cambodian territory operations that were, for years, not publicly acknowledged by the American government. The trail absorbed the bombing, was repaired by the same civilian labor force that had moved artillery up the hills at Dien Bien Phu, and continued moving men and supplies south at rates that kept the NLF operational. Ho Chi Minh was 75 years old in 1965, governing a country that was absorbing American airstrikes daily while simultaneously supporting an insurgency 500 miles to the south. His health was deteriorating. Heart problems had been documented since at least the early 1960s. He traveled less, appeared publicly less often, and delegated the operational direction of the war effort increasingly to Le Duan and the party apparatus. His role was still indispensable, but it was the role of a symbol and a source of political legitimacy more than an active executive. When American presidents or journalists sought to characterize what the other side was fighting for, it was his face and name that answered the question. The anti-war movement in the United States was growing. By 1967, it had moved from the margins of college campuses to mainstream visibility, large demonstrations in Washington and New York. Congressional dissent that had been nearly invisible in 1965, now becoming routine, and the first public breaks from figures within the Democratic establishment itself. McNamara, privately, was losing his confidence in the strategy he had been defending publicly. The crossover point that Westmoreland's attrition model required had not arrived. The enemy was still there, still fighting, still receiving reinforcements from the north through the trail that the bombing had not closed. What neither the American public nor the Johnson administration fully understood in the autumn of 1967 was that the DRV and the NLF were preparing something that would make the gap between official optimism and operational reality impossible to maintain. Tet, and the war that could not be won. The Tet offensive was planned over months in the second half of 1967. The decision to launch it came from the highest levels of the DRV's political and military leadership, and it rested on a strategic assessment that the attrition war of the previous 2 years had reached a point where a dramatic escalation was necessary, not because the DRV was losing, but because the political situation in both Vietnam and the United States required a shock that would change the terms of the conflict. The planning involved GIAP and the military leadership, though subsequent historical research has suggested that Le Duan and the party's political directorate were the primary drivers of the decision. The timing was chosen with particular care. Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, was traditionally a period of ceasefire between the warring sides. Both the DRV and the NLF had agreed to honor a truce during the holiday period of January 1968. The NLF's 85,000 fighters, pre-positioned in cities and towns across South Vietnam, were going to use that truce to get into position. In the early hours of the 30th and 31st of January 1968, simultaneous attacks broke out across more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. The sheer scale of it coordinated strikes on multiple provincial capitals, district towns, military installations, and urban centers, launched within hours of each other across the full length of the country, was unlike anything the American and South Vietnamese commands had been told to expect. The official American assessment in late 1967 had been one of guarded optimism. The official American assessment was immediately and visibly wrong. In Saigon, a 19-man NLF commando team blew a hole through the wall of the American embassy compound and fought inside the grounds for 6 hours. They did not breach the embassy building itself, and they were all killed before morning. But the images of combat in the most secure, most symbolic American installation in Vietnam, transmitted by wire services and television cameras, within hours told a story that no press briefing could fully contain. The American public had been told that the enemy was weakening. The enemy had just attacked the American embassy. The Battle of Hue was the most prolonged engagement of the offensive. NLF and North Vietnamese army forces captured the old imperial city and held most of it, including the historic citadel, for 25 days. The recapture required block-by-block urban combat involving American Marines and South Vietnamese forces against defenders who had prepared their positions and were not easily dislodged. The physical damage to one of Vietnam's most historically significant cities was severe. When South Vietnamese and American forces retook Hue in late February, they discovered mass graves. NLF forces, during their occupation of the city, had systematically executed civilians, government officials, South Vietnamese military officers, teachers, and others identified from prepared lists as enemies of the revolution, along with people who fell into those categories through proximity or misidentification. The number of civilians killed in these executions has been estimated at between 2,800 and 6,000. It was an atrocity of deliberate character, not the chaos of combat, and it occupied a complicated place in the war's history acknowledged in serious scholarship, less consistently prominent in popular American accounts of the conflict than other episodes of the same war. 2 months after Tet began, on the 16th of March, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry of the American Army entered the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province and killed between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians over the course of several hours. The dead were primarily women, children, and elderly men. The massacre was covered up by the military chain of command and did not become publicly known until November of 1969, when the journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. My Lai was not an isolated incident in the full history of American operations in Vietnam, though it was the most thoroughly documented. Its revelation added to what the American public was building toward understanding about what the war actually involved on the ground. The military outcome of the Tet Offensive was, in conventional terms, an NLF and DRV defeat. The hoped-for popular uprising against the Saigon government did not materialize. South Vietnamese civilians did not join the attacking forces in the streets. American and South Vietnamese counterattacks killed approximately 58,000 NLF and NVA fighters across the country in the weeks that followed. The NLF's guerrilla infrastructure in the South, the organizational network that had been built over the previous decade through political organizing, taxation, and local governance, was shattered. The NLF never fully recovered as an independent military and political force. After Tet, the fighting in the South was increasingly carried by regular North Vietnamese army units rather than the Southern insurgency. The political outcome in the United States was the reverse of a military defeat. The Tet Offensive broke the Johnson administration's credibility on Vietnam in a way that no amount of subsequent military success could repair. On the 27th of February, 1968, Walter Cronkite, the CBS News anchor who was at that point the most trusted broadcast journalist in America and who had just returned from Vietnam, delivered an on-air editorial declaring that the United States was mired in stalemate, that the war was not being won, and that negotiation was the only realistic path to any honorable conclusion. Johnson reportedly watched the broadcast and told aides that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. The assessment was accurate. Senator Eugene McCarthy, running against Johnson in the Democratic primary on an anti-war platform, came within a few percentage points of defeating the incumbent president in the New Hampshire primary in March. Robert Kennedy entered the race days later. On the 31st of March, 1968, Lyndon Johnson went on national television and announced that he would not seek re-election. A president who had won the most lopsided electoral victory in American history just 4 years earlier, in 1964, had been driven from office by the political consequences of a war he had escalated with the confident belief that American military power would produce a quick resolution. The months that followed were among the most turbulent in American domestic political history. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June, the night he won the California Democratic primary. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August descended into street fighting between police and anti-war protesters while the delegates were attempting to select a presidential candidate inside. Richard Nixon, running on a campaign that promised a secret plan to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam without specifying what that plan was, won the presidency in November. Nixon's strategy was called Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, accompanied by American troop withdrawals, while maintaining American air support and continuing to pressure the DRV at the negotiating table and through intensified bombing. The logic was that the American presence would shrink while South Vietnamese military capability grew to the point where the Saigon government could sustain itself independently. Whether South Vietnamese forces could realistically reach that level against the DRV's military was a question that American military advisors answered with varying degrees of honesty depending on the audience. The Paris peace talks had opened in May of 1968, initially between the United States and the DRV, later expanded to include the Saigon government and the NLF. They proceeded slowly, interrupted repeatedly by American bombing campaigns and DRV intransigence, while the fighting continued and the casualty counts on all sides continued accumulating. Negotiating while fighting, both sides understood, was a way of continuing the military contest by other means. The pressure the DRV applied at the table was inseparable from the pressure it applied on the ground. Ho Chi Minh had been present in the planning discussions that produced the Tet Offensive, though his health by 1967 and 1968 had deteriorated to the point where his direct involvement in operational decisions was limited. He was 77 years old, experiencing serious heart problems, and spending considerable time receiving medical treatment. His public appearances had become infrequent. The war he had been building toward for 40 years was reaching its decisive phase, and he was watching it from increasing physical distance, while the institutional machinery of the party and the military that he had spent a lifetime constructing carried it forward. He would not live to see how it ended. Ho Chi Minh dies before the end. By the spring of 1969, Ho Chi Minh was receiving regular medical treatment from a team of Soviet and Chinese doctors who had been attending to his declining cardiovascular health for several years. He was 78 years old. The heart problems that had been documented since at least the early 1960s had progressed. He moved slowly. He tired easily. The man who had travelled through 3 continents on foot and by ship, who had lived in caves and jungle camps and rented rooms in a dozen cities, who had been imprisoned and exiled and had crossed international borders in both directions under assumed names, was now largely confined to the compound of his wooden house in Hanoi, receiving visitors and conducting whatever business his strength allowed. In May of 1969, on his 79th birthday, he completed a document he had been working on in fragments over the preceding year. It was his will, a formal statement of his wishes for himself and for the country. He revised it several times over the following months. The document was characteristically plain in its language. He wrote about the party, expressing his confidence that Vietnam would be reunified. He addressed the Vietnamese people directly, expressing solidarity with their sacrifice. He asked that after his death he be cremated, and that his ashes be divided and scattered on hilltops in the north, the center, and the south of Vietnam, one portion in each of the 3 regions he had spent his life trying to bring together as a single country. He did not want a large funeral. He did not want a mausoleum. He died on the 2nd of September, 1969. The date was Vietnam's National Day, the anniversary of the afternoon 24 years earlier, when he had stood in Ba Dinh Square and read the Declaration of Independence to 500,000 people. The coincidence was real, and the party decided not to let it stand uncomplicated. They announced his death on the 3rd of September, rather than the 2nd. To separate the news from the national holiday, and to avoid a situation where Vietnam's Day of Independence became permanently associated with mourning, the official cause was heart failure. The grief that moved through North Vietnam in the days following the announcement was documented by foreign observers as genuine and profound. Schools closed. Factories stopped work. Photographs and accounts from Hanoi describe ordinary people weeping publicly in streets and workplaces, not in the organized, directed way that authoritarian states sometimes produce for foreign cameras, but in the more irregular, uncontrollable way of people responding to the loss of someone they understood as a national father. Whatever Ho Chi Minh's failures as a ruler, and the land reform campaign, and the suppression of intellectual dissent were not small failures. His hold on the emotional identity of North Vietnamese society was authentic in a way that outlasted the particular policies of any given period. His will's instructions were not followed. The party decided that Ho Chi Minh would not be cremated and scattered over 3 hilltops. He would be embalmed and placed in a mausoleum to be built in Ba Dinh Square, the same square where he had proclaimed independence, now to become the permanent home of his preserved remains, available for public viewing in perpetuity. The mausoleum, modelled on Lenin's tomb in Moscow, was completed in 1975. It was, by any measure, a significant departure from the explicit instructions of the man it commemorated. The party has never found this contradiction particularly troubling to explain. What his death meant strategically was that the war he had spent 30 years building toward would be concluded by other men, using the institutions and organizational networks he had created, carrying the political authority his name provided without his direct presence. Le Duan led the party. Giap led the military. The DRV continued to function, to supply the South, to absorb American bombing, and to fight. The momentum that Ho Chi Minh had set in motion did not require him to be alive to continue. Nixon's response to the stalled Paris negotiations and the continued military pressure was to expand the war's geographic scope. Operation Menu, the secret American bombing campaign against North Vietnamese and NLF sanctuaries in Cambodia, had been running since March of 1969, authorized by Nixon and kept from the American public and from Congress. In April of 1970, American and South Vietnamese ground forces crossed into Cambodia to attack these sanctuaries directly. Nixon announced the Cambodian incursion on national television on the 30th of April, framing it as a necessary action to protect American forces and accelerate peace. The announcement produced the largest anti-war demonstrations in American history. On the 4th of May, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on students demonstrating against the war at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students and wounding 9. The photographs of a young woman kneeling over a dead student's body on a campus lawn became one of the defining images of the era. College campuses across the country went on strike. The distance between the United States government and a significant portion of its own population on the subject of the war had moved beyond ordinary political disagreement. In June of 1971, the New York Times and the Washington Post began publishing the Pentagon Papers, a classified Defense Department study of American decision-making in Vietnam that had been leaked by analyst Daniel Ellsberg. The documents covered the period from the Truman administration through the early years of the Johnson presidency and demonstrated, in extensive detail sourced from internal government communications, that multiple administrations had systematically misled the American public about the war's progress, its costs, and the decision-making that had produced it. The Nixon administration attempted to block publication through court injunction. The Supreme Court ruled against the government, and publication continued. For Americans already skeptical about official accounts of the war, the Pentagon Papers provided documentary confirmation that their skepticism had been entirely justified. In the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese Army launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional military attack across multiple fronts in South Vietnam, using tanks and heavy artillery in a style that echoed the final stages of the Chinese Civil War rather than the guerrilla operations of the previous decade. The offensive achieved significant initial gains, capturing the provincial capital of Quang Tri in the north. Nixon responded with Operation Linebacker, the most intensive American bombing of North Vietnam since Rolling Thunder, and with the mining of Haiphong Harbor to cut off the DRV's sea supply lines. The combination of American air power and South Vietnamese ground resistance eventually halted and reversed the NVA's advances. The DRV had demonstrated its conventional military capability and had suffered significant losses doing so. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on the 27th of January, 1973. The agreement provided for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American military forces, and the return of American prisoners of war. It left North Vietnamese forces in place in the south. Approximately 150,000 NVA troops remained on South Vietnamese territory as the agreement was signed, which was a fundamental concession to DRV military reality that the Saigon government had strongly opposed and had ultimately been pressured by Washington to accept. The agreement was presented by Nixon and Kissinger as peace with honor. What it most clearly provided was a mechanism for American military disengagement from a war that the American public would no longer support. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. The fighting between North and South Vietnam continued without them, as both sides had expected it would. American military aid to the Saigon government continued, but the Congress, increasingly hostile to Nixon amid the growing Watergate scandal, began cutting it. Nixon himself resigned the presidency on the 9th of August, 1974, under the pressure of the Watergate investigation. His successor, Gerald Ford, inherited a commitment to South Vietnam that Congress was no longer willing to fund at the levels required. In December of 1974, North Vietnamese forces launched a probing offensive in Quoc Long province in the south. The province fell. The United States did not respond militarily. The DRV's leadership read the outcome carefully and drew the conclusion they had been assessing for months. The American commitment to the defense of South Vietnam had ended in everything but formal declaration. The final campaign was authorized. The forces that Ho Chi Minh had spent his life building were moving south, and this time there would be no pause. The fall of Saigon and the weight of victory. The North Vietnamese Army's final campaign began on the 10th of March, 1975, with an attack on Ban Mi Thuo, a provincial capital in the central highlands of South Vietnam. The city fell within 2 days. President Nguyen Van Thieu, who had replaced Diem after a succession of military governments and had governed the Republic of Vietnam since 1967, made a decision in response to the loss of Ban Mi Thuot that proved catastrophic. He ordered the South Vietnamese army to withdraw from the central highlands and regroup along the coast, abandoning the northern and interior provinces to consolidate forces around the more defensible southern regions. The decision was strategically defensible in theory. In practice, it became a rout. The withdrawal from Pleiku and Kon Tum turned into one of the most disastrous military retreats of the war. Soldiers and civilians moved together down a single road toward the Coast Route 7, a road that had not been maintained for years and that NVA forces quickly moved to interdict. The column, stretching for miles, was shelled and attacked. People abandoned vehicles, weapons, and equipment. Families were separated. The retreat dissolved into flight. The images and accounts that emerged from what became known as the Convoy of Tears documented a collapse not only of military organization but of the Saigon government's hold on any coherent narrative about the war's direction. Hue fell on the 25th of March. The city that the NLF had held for 25 days in 1968, that had been retaken at such cost in urban combat, was abandoned in hours. The South Vietnamese military commanders who might have organized resistance concluded that the situation could not be salvaged and departed. Da Nang, the second largest city in South Vietnam and a major American military base for a decade, fell on the 29th of March. The scenes at the Da Nang docks and airfield as the city fell were filmed and photographed in real-time, crowds of people fighting to board aircraft and ships, soldiers shedding their uniforms and weapons, a city of more than 500,000 people attempting to evacuate in hours. American television carried the footage that evening. The speed of the collapse astonished the DRV's own commanders. General Van Tien Dung, commanding the final campaign, had planned for a 2-year timeline. The actual campaign was running ahead of any schedule they had prepared. City after city along the coast fell in sequence. Quy Nhon, Nha Trang, Da Lat, as South Vietnamese units either fought briefly and were overwhelmed or simply disintegrated before contact. The organized military resistance that American military aid and Vietnamization had been intended to produce was not appearing. By mid-April, NVA forces were converging on Saigon from multiple directions. The Saigon government was attempting to negotiate some form of political settlement that would prevent the total military defeat now clearly coming. Thieu resigned on the 21st of April, delivering a 2-hour television address in which he blamed the United States for abandoning South Vietnam. He left the country 3 days later, taking with him what press accounts described as a considerable quantity of gold. His successor, General Duong Van Minh Big Minh, as he was known, was installed as president with the understanding that he was the figure most acceptable to the other side for a negotiated transfer. The other side was not interested in negotiation by that point. The American evacuation Operation Frequent Wind ran on the 29th and 30th of April. Helicopters flew continuous sorties between American ships in the South China Sea and landing zones in Saigon, lifting out American personnel and Vietnamese employees and associates of the American mission. The image that transmitted around the world was of helicopters on rooftops and crowds pressing toward evacuation points in a city that knew what was coming. Approximately 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopter in those final hours. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked for the American mission, served in the South Vietnamese military, or simply had reason to fear the new government were left behind. At approximately 10:30 in the morning of the 30th of April, a North Vietnamese army tank crashed through the iron gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. A soldier climbed to the roof and raised the NLF flag. General Minh broadcast an unconditional surrender from the palace's radio room. The Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. The war, all of it, the First Indochina War against France, the Second Indochina War against the United States and the Saigon government, a continuous conflict that had run in various forms since 1945 was over. The formal reunification of Vietnam came on the 2nd of July 1976, when the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed, and North and South were joined under a single government for the first time since the Geneva Division of 1954. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The name on the maps was the final public acknowledgement of what the war had decided. The aftermath of reunification was not a simple peace. Hundreds of thousands of former South Vietnamese military officers, government officials, and associated civilians were sent to re-education camps, a system of detention and forced labor that operated for years, in some cases decades, and that drew international condemnation. An estimated 2 to 3 million people fled Vietnam in the years following reunification. The boat people, who took to the South China Sea in overcrowded and frequently unseaworthy vessels, attempting to reach refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Many drowned. Tens of thousands made it to resettlement in Western countries. The diaspora they formed reshaped Vietnamese communities across the world. The full cost of the war resists easy summary. approximately 58,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam. South Vietnamese military losses have been estimated at over 250,000 dead. North Vietnamese and NLF losses over the entire conflict have been estimated at between 800,000 and over 1 million fighters. Civilian deaths across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from bombing, ground combat, reprisals, famine, and displacement have been estimated in figures ranging from 1.5 to 3 million. The Vietnamese landscape had been contaminated by Agent Orange defoliant across millions of acres, with health consequences that persisted for generations. Unexploded ordnance remained buried across the country's farmland and forests decades after the last aircraft left. Ho Chi Minh had been dead for 6 years when the tank pushed through the palace gates. He did not see Saigon renamed, did not see the mausoleum completed in Ba Dinh Square, did not receive the formal answer to the question he had been asking since he was a teenager in Hue, watching French officials move through Vietnamese streets with the ease of people who believed they would always be there. His legacy is genuinely complex in ways that honest history requires acknowledging. The land reform campaign killed thousands of people who should not have died. The suppression of intellectual and political dissent in the North was real and sustained. The re-education camps that followed reunification were not his direct doing, but emerged from the state apparatus he built. The single-party political system that governs Vietnam today was established on foundations he laid. These things are part of the record alongside the other things that are part of the record. That he led the only successful defeat of French colonialism in Asia. That he outlasted and outmaneuvered the most powerful military in the world. That the country he was born in, which had been administered by a foreign government for the entirety of his childhood, was, after his death, governed by Vietnamese people for the first time in decades. He had said, early in his career, that nothing was more precious than independence and freedom. Whether the Vietnam that emerged from his life's work delivered those things adequately to all of its people is a question that Vietnamese citizens continue to live inside, in ways that do not resolve into simple answers. What is not in question is that the colonial order he set out to dismantle no longer exists, that the country he was born in is whole, and that the connection between those two facts runs directly through the life of one man from Nghe and province who left on a ship in 1911 with no money and a question he spent 60 years answering. And there it is, the full arc of one life stretched across a century that remade the world. If you are still awake, that is all right. The story has reached its end, and you can rest now. There is another journey waiting for you on screen, a new story, a different time, another life worth knowing. If this one stayed with you, feel free to like the video, subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments below. It genuinely helps, but for now, let your body go heavy. Let your thoughts slow down. Close your eyes. The history will be here in the morning. Good night.